Okay, I'm doing another tag today. This is the Horror BookTube Tag. I was tagged by Dane Reeds. I'll link to that video in the description below. Thank you, as always, for the tag, sir. With apologies, though, I'm not going to be able to do this tag justice. I was looking at the questions, and for most of the questions, I really don't have a good answer to them. And I think this is because I just really have not read that many horror books in my life, really, even if I kind of go back to all the books I've read. So I'm going to do this one a little bit differently, and I'm just going to talk about the books that I have read that I remember, and just kind of do this as a list rather than answering the questions. So first of all, sorry for that. Secondly, advance warning. This has the potential to get kind of more long-winded, kind of talking through a list of books than it would just answering the questions. So if you don't want to watch this, fair enough. Dane Reeds kind of mentions in his video, which I think is a good point, that horror is kind of like romance, in the sense that it's almost kind of not like a pure genre in itself. Well, I mean, it can be. But it also kind of is part of almost every other genre. So, you know, like there's some romance in an action book, or some romance in an adventure book. The same way, sometimes the line between kind of what is a horror book and what is like a fantasy or adventure book can be a little bit ambiguous, or science fiction book. And there's a few things on my list that I'm not really sure if I can call them horror or if they belong to another genre. And I'll be kind of exploring that ambiguity as we go through. I'll start off with Frankenstein. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So this was kind of the first horror story that I ever came across. As a kid, I had it was a book on tape accompanied by a comic book. These were popular in like the mid-'80s, if anyone else remembers them. It was put out by Fisher-Price, who took Marvel Comics version of classic books, and they simplified them even more for a younger audience. And you had an accompanying cassette tape, and you could listen to the cassette tape as you followed along with the comic book. So it was geared towards kind of young kids. I was like 7 or 8 when I had this. And I remember up until then, like I knew who Frankenstein was. Like I knew there were monster movies. I wasn't allowed to see them. And I had this image of like a horror story being like the monster just kind of goes around killing people. So, you know, like you watch like a 2-hour movie and it's just 2 hours of the monster walking down the street, killing one person after the other, which as a kid kind of seemed kind of scary to me. And I remember listening to the story of Frankenstein and being like, so that's how it works. It's not just like the whole story is a monster going around killing people. It's like there's a plot and a story, and there's a main character who's not the monster. It was kind of interacting with the monster. Over the years, I've read a number of other abridged versions of Frankenstein. I finally got around to reading the Mary Shelley unabridged version of it a couple years ago. I did this with my book club at the time. I was struck when I read this that the original Mary Shelley book is really not a horror story as we think of horror stories today. In other words, the monster is not like creeping up on people, and there's no like gradual tension being built. There's really no tension at all in the book, because almost every time when somebody is dead, or when the monster kills somebody, you find out first they're dead, and then like how they got killed by the monster is told in the backstory. So it kind of completely kind of takes out the suspense or the terror. But it is very gothic. She is kind of definitely building a mood here that's a very kind of spooky gothic mood. It struck me, I think, after I read this, that she's really playing up the pathos, or kind of how tragic all these deaths are, which made this book seem much more like a tragedy. In fact, maybe, Victor Frankenstein being like this arrogant scientist who kind of brings his own tragedy among himself by trying to, I don't know, be arrogant or do this science experiment. It almost kind of, maybe because Victor Frankenstein, through his own arrogance, brought about the tragedy, maybe kind of more in line with like a classical Greek tragedy than with a modern horror movie. Modern horror story. Keep forgetting we're talking about books and not movies. I think most of the horror I've watched over the years has been in the movie form. The other one, talking about Frankenstein, I guess you have to talk about Dracula. Dracula is another one where I read an abridged version of it as a kid. I finally got around to doing the complete version when I was about 22. And I did it as an audiobook. And I think it mostly worked as an audiobook. My attention, I used to listen to this while I was driving. And I remember that I was distracted, or my attention was beginning to wander during kind of the end of it. So the events at the end, I'm not sure I fully absorbed listening to this as the audiobook. I mean, I knew the story anyways because I had read abridged versions of it before. Yeah, Dracula is another book that's very gothic. It sets like a very certain mood to it, especially the beginning parts when he's in Transylvania. And a prisoner in Dracula's castle. Like the mood that gets set is like so classically gothic. But the book really isn't all that scary by today's standards. And I think it really starts to drag when it gets back to London. I don't know. Let me know what you think. But I thought it got a little bit boring in the middle when they're back in London. If you've read the book, you know that it's got this interesting narrative going on, where the whole book is there's no narrator. It's just told entirely in letters and diary extracts, and I think one character at a point records himself on a phonograph. So it's I guess, what do they call it? An epistolatory novel? I mean, it includes some diary as well, but it's just a collection of documents. I guess it would be like the novel equivalent of like found footage today, right? Where somebody has just kind of gone through and found all these letters and found all these diaries and then kind of put them in chronological order to make a novel. Which is clever, but again, it does kind of take away some of the suspense of it, maybe, because, well, or does it? I don't know. Actually, ignore that. Maybe it doesn't take away the suspense. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or I think the full title is something like The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or something like that. Anyways, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Read that, I don't remember, about 5 years ago. Found it a very quick read. It's how long was it? I forget exactly the page number, but it's a very short little book. Did not realize kind of how short this book was going into it, but it's like round about 100 pages or something like that. So you can read it quite easily in an afternoon, which I did. It's another book that's not really terribly scary by today's standards. It's arguably, it's got some interesting philosophical stuff going on there about like the duality of man's nature, which the author doesn't really explore in depth, but you know, it kind of makes you think a little bit. Yeah, Phantom of the Opera. Phantom of the Opera is it's another book which, I mean, there have been a number of horror movies made out of it, especially kind of, you know, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. Well, I guess there's a famous 1925 version and the famous 1940s version. Before it kind of got turned into like a romance story, which I guess is what it's most famous as now. Yeah, it's interesting. It's another story where I'm not entirely sure, is it a horror story or is it just kind of a detective story? And it's a romance story. It's certainly got elements of all of them. So, yeah, I read this way back when. I read this when I was like in 8th grade or something. And I remember kind of getting really hooked, especially at the ending when they're going kind of down into the Phantom's lair and stuff like that. I don't remember it being particularly scary. I think there's a mystery there, and you know, some people get killed by. I think it's almost more of a detective story. But you know, as with all these stories, I think maybe definition of horror has changed over time. So maybe back in its day it was considered more horror. I don't know. Yeah, H.G. Wells. I read The Invisible Man way back when. I think I was in 6th grade when I read The Invisible Man. I do not remember it at all, so I really can't talk intelligently about it. I remember struggling a bit through it. I thought it was a bit boring. If I read it again now, maybe it would go quicker, because I have had that experience with H.G. Wells, where I read him in middle school and kind of struggled with him, and then read him as an adult and found that, as an adult, he was much easier to read and much more enjoyable to read. It's another one I don't actually remember being scary either, really. Speaking of H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds. This is another one where, again, coming back to that ambiguity, is it science fiction or is it horror? I think there are definitely horror elements to it. I read War of the Worlds about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. It's another one I had read an abridged version of as a kid. So I knew the story, I knew where it was going, but I read the unabridged version. War of the Worlds, I like H.G. Wells. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells is one of my favorite books of all time. War of the Worlds, I thought, was a little bit of a slog, but that may be because at this point, this story has been overdone so much. I mean, there's been so many imitators that you kind of just knew all the plot points and you just had to slog through it. Like, okay, here the army is coming. The army is firing at them. They can't defeat the army. Okay, now they're just taking over the whole world. I don't know. I felt like it was a little bit predictable. That being said, I think there are parts of War of the Worlds that are really creepy, like that when they're kind of trapped in that house. He and the priest are trapped in that house. Yeah, the Time Machine, I don't know if the Time Machine really counts, but I thought the Time Machine was really creepy, or had a very kind of creepy vibe to it all throughout. Maybe it counts a little bit. It's more of like a creepy than it is scary. Speaking of which, Sherlock Holmes. So detective stories are sometimes just kind of intellectual puzzles, but sometimes they're kind of famous for setting up like a spooky, eerie vibe. And the Sherlock Holmes story that is most famous for doing that is The Hound of Baskervilles, where they're out on the English moors, which is like, I'm from America, so I've never been, but the way it's described in the book is it's just completely covered in fog at night, right? Like this really heavy fog where you can't see anything, and there's these dogs that howl at night, and apparently there's this monster dog who's kind of out in the moors, but you can't see him, you can just hear this howling. Does a really good job of creating like a spooky atmosphere. So I guess I'd count that one. Dane Reeds mentioned a book called I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And I had almost forgotten I read that one. But then I'm like, yes, I read that one as well. I can count that one. This is a really good book. It's not only a horror book, but it does some really interesting things with the storytelling, which I'm not going to spoil, and which shouldn't be spoiled. Try and go out and find this book and read it without knowing anything about it if you can. But yeah, it does also have a horror element to it. It's told kind of, there's two kind of stories going on. There's a story of him trying to survive the vampires. And there's also flashback scenes to kind of how the vampires took over the world in the first place. And both stories are kind of told concurrently. And they're really creepy. It reminds me of Stephen King. But it was written all the way back in the 1950s. So it's just a reminder, I guess, that the horror genre was kind of well alive in the 1950s. And yeah, Stephen King kind of cites this as one of his influences. And you can totally see it a bit. Speaking of Stephen King, this is an omission on my part. Not an omission. This is something I'm missing from my book list. I have not read a lot of Stephen King over the years. I've only read 3 books: Hearts in Atlantis, The Stand, and The Gunslinger, Part 1. The Dark Tower, Part 1, The Gunslinger. Of these, I'm not really sure any of them count as horror. They all have creepy elements. Hearts in Atlantis, definitely not. The Gunslinger has creepy elements to it, but I'm not really sure it's horror. The Stand is often described as horror, and in fact, Dane Reeds included that in his list, so I guess kind of following his lead, maybe I should as well. Although he acknowledged that it's got a lot of other elements in it. It's kind of like post-apocalyptic. It's kind of like almost more of an epic story of kind of this battle of good versus evil. But yeah, there are definitely... Yeah, I guess you could count it as horror, huh? There are definitely like a lot of scary elements to it. Yeah, okay, I'm going to count that one as horror. I've talked myself into it. Yeah, what else? Another one that's a very kind of short story is Slime by Joseph Payne Brennan. It's another old one. It's from like the 1930s or 40s or something like that. I first read this as a kid, and it was in a scary story collection. So it wasn't a novel in its own right. And I think that's how you often find it, is it's part of scary story collections. It was apparently this is the one that The Blob was based off of. That 1950s movie with Steve McQueen, but they changed the name because they didn't want to pay the rights to Joseph Payne Brennan. But it's the same idea of this mysterious piece of slime that's just eating people in a small town. I found that kind of, I wouldn't say like it scared me as a kid, but I found it delightfully, eerily creepy. Worth checking out. Oh, that reminds me, something else. Speaking of stuff that got changed in Hollywood to avoid paying people or something. The Werewolf of Paris, which was by Guy Endore. I think it came out in the 1930s. And Hollywood expressed an interest in it and tried to get him to like sell it to him or write the script for something. There was something going on there. And the negotiations didn't work out. And so I think they just made the Wolfman movie instead. So arguably this is kind of connected to the inspiration for the Wolfman movie, which came out in the 1940s. But this book is different. I actually read this book because of my interest in the Paris Commune. because it takes place during the Paris Commune, but it's a werewolf story. It's a great story, fascinating at points. I'll do a whole separate video on that at some point, but it kind of interweaves like the history of the Paris Commune in with this werewolf story, and he does it very well. Definitely worth checking out. What else? I think that's all, or at least that's all I can remember right now. I'll probably think of something else after I shut off the camera. But those are the main ones that stick in my mind. So yeah, again, apologies for not doing this tag properly. I'll leave all the questions for the tag though, if you want to do it yourself. And other people I need to tag on this. I'll tag Graham Quigley and the guys at Stripped Cover Lit. Yeah, just those two.